Okay, Sheldon Primes again. We're going to keep going with our Subpart C. So with the Subpart C, it's going to be record-keeping forms and then the record-keeping criteria itself. So the criteria, meaning what do you record, that is, it really just takes the place of, it gives you a set system of knowing what goes on your records and what does not go on your records. So if it's a work-related in a new case or it meets any of the general criteria for record keeping, then it has to go onto your 300 log, your 301, and then your 300A summary log. I did mention before previously that one hospitalization, one amputation, one loss of eye, OSHA must be notified within 24 hours, and fatalities within 8 hours of when you find out. You must notify them. So this is how you do that notification. There's an online form. You could go to your nearest area office, or you could call the hotline 1-800-321-OSHA 6742. So those are your ways that you can report any injuries. In the past, Ashley Furniture has been fined for not reporting amputation. That's the link right there. But it was an $11,000 violation. They didn't report their 300 log correctly, and that was $1,100. And then incorrectly reporting the 301, and that was also $1,100. So it can be costly, and these are the old figures before the actual rates have gone up for citations. So it could be very, very costly if you don't do this right. So it's a 5-step process. So we'll go through this 5-step process, and this is how you determine what goes into your injury and illness logs. So number 1 is, did the employee experience an injury or illness? Number 2, is that injury or illness work-related? Number 3, is that injury or illness a new case? Number 4, does the injury or illness meet the general criteria or the application of a specific case? And then if all those are yes, that you're going to record it as an injury or illness. So the very first thing is, did your employee experience an injury or illness? So you have here a definition saying an injury or illness is an abnormal condition or disorder. Injuries include cases such as, but not limited to, a cut, a fracture, a sprain, or amputation. Illness including both acute and chronic illnesses, such as, but not limited to, a skin disease, respiratory disorder, or poisoning. So you have to determine that. This example that they give you here first is a worker reporting to a nurse's station with a complaint of a painful wrist. The employee is given 2 Advils and returned to the job. What do you do? So the thing is first you're trying to determine, did the person experience an abnormal condition? And yes, a painful wrist is abnormal. You're not supposed to have pain in your wrist. So you're not putting it in a log yet, but you're trying to determine, is there an injury or illness? So person, I got 2 people exposed to chlorine gas. They're rushed to the hospital. They're told to stay home the next day as a precautionary measure. So there's no treatment, but you don't know if they had an injury or illness until they report back to you how well they're doing. So in that case, you may have to wait a little bit more to figure out if there is an illness or injury due to that exposure to that chlorine gas. Next is it work-related? So this work-related definition can be tricky. Work-relatedness is presumed for injuries and illnesses resulting from events or exposure occurring in the work environment unless an exception specifically applies. A case is presumed work-related if and only if an event or exposure in the work environment is a discernible cause of the injury or illness, or of a significant aggravation to a pre-existing condition. So there are a few things that they'll say is your work-relatedness. So an event or exposure in the work environment either caused or contributed to the resulting condition or significantly aggravated a pre-existing condition. However, it is presumed that your injury and illness results from an event exposure occurring in the work environment. So now you need that definition of what that work environment is. So, work environment, establishment or locations where employees are working or present as a condition of their employment. So you got to be there. So that's your condition of your employment or you're doing work. And that does include equipment and materials that you're used to do whatever your output is. If you have a pre-existing condition which was being treated or under control, but due to some work aggravation, now you've experienced one of these four following. They say death results in resulting in whatever the exposure was, loss of consciousness. If there's a days away, days restricted, or job transfer, that's a DART instance. So DA was the days away, R is restricted, T is transfer, so that's a DART instance, or some sort of medical treatment. So you've gone beyond first aid, now you need medical treatment. So now that is a significant aggravation. Unless there is an exception that is at play. If you're at work as just a general member of the public, all right, that is not your employee's fault or responsibility if you get injured. If you have symptoms solely due to non-related events or exposure, non-work related event or exposure, anything voluntary participation is an exception. Eating, drinking, or preparing food or drink for personal consumption, now that is also an exception. So that's a big one. If someone's cutting themselves, getting lacerated, need stitches, but that is preparing food for their personal consumption, then that is a noted exemption. Another exemption, not work related if you're doing personal tasks outside of your assigned working hours. Personal grooming, self-infliction for non-related condition, or intentionally self-inflicting, then those are exceptions. Any motor vehicle accident in a parking lot or access road during your commute, meaning you're going into uh, your your work day basically, then that is an exception. Common cold or flu, mental illness, and they do have a few things. If the mental illness is related to some sort of exposure, let's say your SDS sheet on a chemical says that one of the symptoms for overexposure can be mental illness, then that is a job-related injury. If you're traveling, work-related traveling, that is not, well, it really depends. Once you're in a hotel, it's basically your work is now taking you to an establishment which is basically called your home away from home. So if you are doing any activity in the interest of an employer and you get injured, then that is work related. So that phrase, in the interest of an employer, is a very important one. But if you are doing a duty that is personal in nature and it's not related to your work or in the interest of your employer, then that is not a recordable injury. If there's workers working telecommuting, working at home, and it's okay, so a lot of people do that. If the work that they're doing is in the interest of the employer and they got injured, then it's recordable. But if it's a condition of the home environment and they got injured, then that is not recordable. So it just really depends. It can't be tripping over the toys that are on the floor that gets the person injured. It has to be actually doing whatever product or whatever job they are doing for the company that is caused the injury or illness. So this one, voluntary, we're going to stop there because that is an exception. You're doing anything voluntary. If an employee sprains an ankle in the company parking lot on his way to work, go on, that is work related. If they're going to or from, it doesn't matter if they're on a lunch break, paid lunch break, an unpaid lunch break, it doesn't matter if the person is injured, needing medical treatment beyond first aid, then that is a recordable accident. The only exception is a parking lot for motor vehicle accidents during a commute. Other than that, there is no exception. In this scenario, the employee is doing something as a member of the general public, not as an interest of the employer. And so therefore, that is not a recordable injury if they get injured. Next thing is if you're determining if it's a new case versus an old case. So a new case will be if someone has injured a body part that wasn't previously injured, then that is a new case. Or if they did have the body part that was previously injured, but they had a full recovery, then that is a new case. So it really depends on your licensed medical provider. That's the opinion that you're looking for. If you have a reoccurrence of something like a rash they have here or asthma, then yes, that is going to be a new case. So if the signs and symptoms of tuberculosis, silicosis, asbestosis, those are some diseases that are they are long-term chronic type diseases. So let's say your worker is exposed to silica dust at your location. So that is a chronic type thing that may show up in, I don't know, 7, 8 years. In some cases, depending on exposure, then okay, you've got at the time of diagnosis, and that is going to be a new case for you. So here's a worker that is completely recovered, but they're on light duty, and now 2 weeks later, after being completely recovered, they injured the same body part. So now that one will count as a new injury. Same situation, slightly different, where this one is saying that the worker is still taking prescription medication and injures the same body part, the wrist. Then if they're taking prescription medication, that means that they probably have not been released to the doctors in order for them to get that medical release. So that would be an update on your 300 log if they miss more days or something of that effect. So that is it's an existing case. So here is the employee fractures their foot at work every 6 months or so. So that means that if they are placed on light duty, if they're put back because the doctor released them, and this happens again 6 months, then now that becomes a situation where that worker is getting another injury or illness. So therefore, that one is going to be a case where you will have to write it in one more time if they're released. If not, then it's update on the existing record, so it's not a case where that person is released. So the general criteria. If any of these things happen, an injury or illness is recordable if results in one or more of the following: death, days away, restricted, transfer of medical treatment beyond first aid, loss of consciousness, or significant injury diagnosed by a professional licensed healthcare provider, then automatically those things become recordable. So in this case, you're really going to have to plan those things out. So those are your steps, your 4 steps of figuring out what goes into your injury and illness logs. So there's several questions on this. There's a lot of letter interpretation. If you go into the CFR in 1904 Section 7, you can see an if-then scenario. So that's a very important one to get a hold of. So before we get into the next portion of this, I just want to we'll stop here. We'll do the next portion in another video so you're not overwhelmed with this information.